Okay, good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone. I'm Daniel Benjamin. I'm the president of the Academy, and I want to thank you for joining us for tonight's Charles Heimoff Lecture in German Studies. Tonight's talk, Yiddish Trash, Popular Fiction in Diaspora, will be delivered by Saul Zaritt, Assistant Professor of Yiddish Language and Ashkenazi Culture at The Ohio State University. And one has to ritually say, remember, it's the Ohio State University. I'm excited about this event because this is, to the best of our knowledge, the first lecture on Yiddish and Yiddish culture in the history of the American Academy. Yeah, so don't screw up, Saul. We've had many scholars of Jewish studies in the past. Earlier in this semester, in a remarkable coincidence, we had a fellow deliver part of his introduction in Yiddish. That was our linguist in residence, Ross Perlin, who also broke into Chinese later in the talk. What a show-off. When he was questioned by a seemingly monolingual Chinese linguist who was attending the talk. That was very, very special. There must be a Yiddish expression for when it rains, it pours, right? 2 Yiddishes in one semester. But we have not, to my knowledge, had a fellow who was truly a Yiddishist, and I'm thrilled that we do. Yiddish was the language of millions of people living at one point from San Francisco to Buenos Aires, to the Scheunenviertel here in Berlin, and then on to Shanghai. But of course, for most of the millennium that preceded the Holocaust, it was above all the language of Ashkenazi Jews who lived in the largely, although not exclusively, German-speaking lands of Central Europe. And it is considered a Germanic language, even if it includes vocabulary from Hebrew and the Slavic languages itself. Yiddish culture, of course, produced literary giants, including Isaac Bashevis Singer, his brother I.J. Singer, Shalom Aleichem, Der Nister, and Chaim Grada, whose last book, amazingly, has just been published more than 40 years after his death. It was the native language of Shai Agnon, Saul Bellow, Paul Celan, among others. But as the language of Eastern European Jewry, it was also the vessel of an enormously rich and varied culture that was high, middle, and low, a culture that deserves study in all its aspects. And those are all great reasons to examine the language and its artifacts and to have Saul Zaritt here at the American Academy doing exactly that. Now, I have to say that as an American, I was a victim of the desire to forget all those ancestral languages. But I still believe that the first non-English phrase I ever knew was, "Ve is mir." I thought it was English. Anyway, before I introduce Saul more fully, I'd like to say a few words about this fellowship. Some of you may be confused because you were already here for a Heimoff lecture, a wonderful talk delivered by our fellow Nora Krug. Indeed, the Heimoff Foundation, or Fondation Heimoff in Geneva, is supporting fully 3 fellows at the Academy this semester. The foundation is the legacy of Charles Heimoff, appropriately for this institution, a born Berliner, later an American, an entrepreneur, international businessman, and a true polyglot. The foundation was established to promote German culture and German studies, and we are profoundly grateful for their generosity and also for their recognition that Yiddish studies belongs in the ambit of German studies. Our speaker, Saul Zaritt, is an assistant professor of Yiddish language, as I mentioned, at The Ohio State University, where he is indeed a member of the Department of Germanic Languages and Literatures. He studies modern Jewish writing and the politics of translation, examining how writers cross and inhabit boundaries between cultures. And as you can tell from the title of tonight's lecture, he has a deep interest in Yiddish popular culture and the experience of Ashkenazim in a period of tremendous social change. Now, with a focus on Yiddish literature in the 20th century, Saul's research tracks how texts labeled as Jewish by the writers themselves or by critics and institutions respond to the modern demand for legibility and translatability. His work also brings the digital humanities to bear on literary study, and in 2023, he launched shund.org, a database of popular fiction written in Yiddish and serialized in the Yiddish press. Saul is the author of Jewish American Writing and World Literature, Maybe to Millions, Maybe to Nobody. What a great title. And then a Teich Manifesto, Yiddish translation in the making of modern Jewish culture. His research has been supported by fellowships at the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research, the Frankel Institute for Advanced Jewish Studies at the University of Michigan, and the Center for Jewish Studies at Harvard, among others. He holds an undergraduate degree in comparative literature from the University of Chicago, an MA in Hebrew literature from Hebrew University, and a PhD in Jewish literature from the Jewish Theological Seminary of New York. He has held teaching positions at Harvard University and at Washington University in St. Louis. And while Saul's project at the Academy focuses mostly on the 19th and 20th centuries, we are glad to welcome someone tonight who is interested in the revitalization of Yiddish for the 21st century, who will be in conversation with Saul tonight. Jake Schneider, right here. This is actually a job title I have not seen on the 1040 income tax form. Yiddish activist. I want that job. Poet, translator, and independent researcher based in Berlin. Jake initiated Berlin's Yiddish-speaking social club, Schmuis und Wein? Wein. Verzeihen. Okay, he's also the initiator of the Yiddish Hoyts, is that right? Hoyts, okay, I said it right. Language immersion program at the Yiddish Summer in Weimar. He is a founding MC of Shtetl Berlin's open mic cabaret. New Yiddish in all its art forms. Yiddish is just more fun than other languages. And one of the main organizers, is it Yiddish.Berlin or Yiddish Berlin? Okay, someone snuck in a period there, which hosts art exhibitions and literary events. It is really something that Berlin has a Yiddish renaissance going on. Just 2 years ago, there was a Yiddish language table at the Wissenschaftskolleg. Go figure. He also gives talks about Yiddish culture and walking tours of Berlin's Jewish immigrant history. And his own Yiddish poems have appeared in a whole range of publications, beginning with the Vorwärts, and they've been translated into 5 languages. Wow. Saul and Jake have a lot in common. They only met here when Saul started his residency at the Academy here in Berlin, the center of the Yiddish revival. Anyway, we very much look forward to hearing their conversation. The format, Saul will talk for about 30 minutes. He will be followed by the discussion on stage with Jake and with Q&A. Once we open for questions, raise your hand. Usually I say we expect a question mark, but on this subject, I'm sure we'll just get lots of declarations, all with varying levels of intensity and conviction. I also want to remind everyone that our mission is to promote open and thoughtful dialogue and to be a place of serious discussion so that we, when we have this conversation tonight, please respect differing perspectives. Thank you very much. Saul Zaritt, the floor is yours. Great to have you here.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. Thank you, Dan, for that kind introduction, and thank you to the Charles Heimoff Foundation for supporting my time here at the Academy. Also, thank you to the Academy staff for everything they do for this event tonight, but also for my family's time here. I'm required to greet my children, who I think are watching on the stream. So, servus, vayubesk. I'm grateful to Jake for joining, and I look forward to our conversation later. And I'm also thankful to my fellows who have made this fall really a joy, reassuring me of the pleasure and vitality of conversation, a really important thing in some dark times. So, okay, now to talk about trash and Yiddish. So first, I'm going to begin with a warning or a threat, of course, of a kind, though maybe some of you will take it as an encouragement, but that's your own problem. What I'm going to do is quote from Franz Kafka. In 1912, he gave this short little lecture on Yiddish to a group of German-speaking Prague Jews, and he opened up with this statement. Mochte ich Ihnen, sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, noch sagen, wie viel mehr Jargon Sie verstehen, als Sie glauben, which I'll translate into Yiddish for everyone in the audience. Rabbi Sai, wie viel Yiddish versteht ihr? Take mehr wie ihr glaubt. And if there's anyone who doesn't understand what has happened yet so far, it's you understand more Yiddish than you think. So as I think Dan explained, some of it, Yiddish is a 1,000-year-old language of Eastern European Jewry mostly. At the turn of the 20th century, was the language of the majority of the world's Jewish communities. It's a Germanic language, a fusion language, meaning it carries with it all these other languages inside of it, so archaic remnants from Romance languages, preservation of old German dialects, plenty of Slavic words and grammatical structures, and of course, lots of Hebrew and Aramaic. Yiddish likely began somewhere in German lands. The linguists think Rhineland somewhere, but then, of course, it moved over time to Eastern Europe, to Poland in the 16th century. And then in the 19th and 20th centuries, with the mass migration of Eastern European Jews, became a global language as Jews moved to Western Europe, the US, Latin America, Palestine, South Africa, Australia, and beyond. And significantly, it then became, especially as a language of American Jewry and American culture, became part of the vocabulary of now globalized American humor. But not to mention also Yiddish remains the language of growing Hasidic and ultra-Orthodox communities. So I would say whether you're a German speaker or not, or simply a global citizen of one kind or another, I can assure you, you know more Yiddish than you think. The question is, what kind of Yiddish do you know? And what other Yiddishes remain to be discovered or learned? And that's something I'll be talking about today. And that leads me to a second warning that I'll be making before I begin. I want to make clear that I won't be talking much about the Holocaust or about any of the other disasters of Eastern European Jewry of the 20th century. One could indeed tell a tragic story of Yiddish, about the destruction of Yiddish-speaking communities in Europe and beyond. But one of the things I want to emphasize is that there's much to Yiddish beyond tragedy, or we might say next to tragedy. Much that eludes narratives of catastrophe and recovery, nostalgia and rebirth, or renaissance, or something having to do with the national or the religious. So today I want to talk about trash, or in Yiddish, Schund. And I mean the term neutrally or even somewhat affectionately. So we often call a cultural object trash in order to distance ourselves from it. I really don't like those reality TV shows or those soap operas. They're just trash. But of course, you all secretly watch them religiously. You're obsessed with them. And while no one here is going to be forced to confess anything about what trash they consume, I'm sure that all of us know exactly what we're going to watch later tonight after we've had this lovely intellectually stimulating evening. I've heard at least from one person tonight that there's a new season of Love is Blind Denver, which just came out yesterday, which you're welcome to watch. It's not an advertisement or endorsement, just a suggestion. So there's this thing that supposedly has no value, yet it's something we feel a deep connection to, that we turn to for comfort, for distraction, and that often connects us to larger and larger groups of people that we wouldn't otherwise associate with in our normal professional or social lives. These forms of so-called cheap entertainment facilitate a kind of cultural mobility while lowering the stakes so that our participation or lack thereof is very, very difficult to measure, right? If you miss the Love is Blind Denver for some reason you wanted to watch the Los Angeles one, you missed the Denver one, you won't feel like it's really terrible that you've missed it. You might be sad. You might set it out to watch it later, but you don't feel like there's much depending on it, or at least you think that much depends on it. And this isn't usually how we think about Yiddish cultural objects. The stakes can sometimes be quite high. If Yiddish is a language of a destroyed and lost world, one can feel compelled to bring all of that overdetermined stuff into the room, such that every utterance in Yiddish, in or about Yiddish even, feels very weighted, as if some redemption depended on my pronunciation, for instance, or your ability to understand a good Yiddish word. This kind of pressure can also lead to a reaction of the other side, that on the face of it feels the opposite of serious and somber, as the idea of Yiddish humor. In this overreaction, every Yiddish word, every Yiddish sound becomes hilarious. Discomfited by the language's decline and destruction, the comedian and their audience laugh at Yiddish, reenacting the disaster, killing or slaying it, as in the slang of the comedy nightclub. And it is claimed that this laughter is supposed to be redemptive in and of itself, right? It is laughter through tears. It is therapeutic laughter. It is the laughter of survival, the survival of the Jewish people, or the survival of whoever has some claim on Yiddish. Now, for me, trapping Yiddish between these two poles, between disaster on the one hand and redemptive humor on the other, seems to be a rather reductive way to talk about a language and a culture that is, like any other human thing, much more dynamic than that. So yes, you know more Yiddish than you think, and some of that Yiddish is terribly sad or unbearably funny. But what if, for tonight, you suspended all of that or let it fade into the background somewhere and let yourself consume Yiddish, hear Yiddish, as if it were trash, as if it were a guilty pleasure, as if it were something ephemeral, discardable, unownable, but also something you're kind of addicted to, something that feels infinitely reproducible, something that you need, but you don't know exactly why. What might happen then? So what we're going to do is dig into some Yiddish trash, some shund, and see what we find. Okay. So some background on Yiddish popular literature, just to get us on the same page, although I'm sure everyone knows lots about it. Beginning in the 19th century, Jews of Eastern Europe started experiencing the grand shifts of modernity, so urbanization, migration, nationalism, socialism, and much besides. And with reforms in the Russian Empire and growing immigrant communities in the US, suddenly there were large urban masses of Yiddish speakers clamoring for cultural production in Yiddish that would rival the kinds of things that were appearing in imperial languages like English, Russian, German, French, and so on. So by the late 19th century, in the US and Eastern Europe, they developed many of these fledgling and sometimes faltering Yiddish cultural institutions, things like libraries and theater troupes, political movements and salons, newspapers, and publishing houses. Now, these ventures had little to no government support, or sometimes were placed under harsh government censorship, and they're even sometimes attacked by Jewish intellectual elites. So none of these ventures were particularly stable. But there was an enormous energy to start producing popular culture, including the creation of popular Yiddish literature. Now, this may be something of an argument that can be disputed, but it can be said that Yiddish popular literature started with a few writers in Eastern Europe, notably the famed writer Shomer, Nochem Meir Sheikevich. And the story goes that he was writing some articles and essays for an elite intellectual Hebrew journal, and a publisher came to him and said, why don't you try writing something in a language of the vernacular of the majority of your readers, and maybe we'll make some money. And the story goes that the next 3 or 4 or 5 days, he wrote 9 novellas. It was sort of an explosion of creativity, and then he produced over 200 novels over the next 30 years. Now, some of you may have heard of his rival, Sholem Aleichem, very dapper Sholem Aleichem here, and the author behind the stories that became Fiddler on the Roof. But at every turn, Shomer outsold Sholem Aleichem at every turn. He was the bestseller, including after his death. So that Shomer already died in 1905, and he was still one of the bestsellers in Yiddish literature. And to give you an example of why he might be popular, I'll just choose one of his 200 novellas, and that's this one. Ein Mann mit drei Weiber, eine lustige und höchst interessante Roman. One man with three wives, an entertaining and very interesting novel. So a little primitive ad language there, but it still works. The novella is supposedly adapted from a play by the French writer Eugène Scribe, but of course Schomer didn't know any French. So it's from the German, supposedly. But I don't know how much relationship this text has to any original. It's a romp with several mistaken and hidden identities. There's a torrid secret love affair, border smuggling, a nagging wife, and much more. All in 40 pages, of course. So many tried to emulate Schomer's model, and this created what critics called at the time a Heftenepidemie, a pamphlet epidemic of the 1890s, which spread across the US, and then the pamphlets were cheaply made in the US and then also shipped back to Eastern Europe. Hundreds of pamphleted novels were authored, and these were sometimes entirely new stories, sometimes loose translations or adaptations from those same imperial languages. Now, this epidemic didn't last very long. It was a very short epidemic, since the main source of Yiddish literature soon shifted in the early 20th century to the Yiddish newspaper. Here's Marlon Brando reading a Yiddish newspaper. There's a story behind that we can save for another time. Newly urban workers in Eastern European and US cities couldn't really afford books, but they were very invested in the Yiddish newspaper, which were less sources of news than sources of entertainment. The Yiddish press encouraged the modernization of its readers, to educate them to become more American or more European, but they also wanted to meet the readers where they were, somewhere in between cultural spheres. So the pages included very strange and cultural contradictions. They were creating a Jewish home for their readers, but also fed them transnational forms of culture. So, for example, you have here the front page of Der Tag, the Day. This is from 1922. And it will have on the front page lots of news stories, but they're news stories that are tailored towards a Jewish audience. So to translate the titles, there's actually German news on the front page. Kuno assembles a new German cabinet. He was about to become chancellor. But then also right next to it, 15,000 immigrants allowed from Poland. And of course, a significant number of those immigrants would have been Jewish immigrants to the United States, but also local Jewish news, right? Jewish druggist robbed on 2nd Avenue. On the same level, of course, also as Nansen convincing the Soviet government to accept the return of 1.5 million Russian refugees following World War I and the civil wars. Many of those also would have been Jewish refugees. Now, on the back page of that same newspaper, so on page 8 or 9 or 10 sometimes, you had these kinds of things. So on the left side here, you have a chapter from the latest potboiler novel. We'll come back to this novel later. But on the right side, you have a picture cribbed directly from the American press scandals around vaudeville and Broadway actors. So this is Minna Gombel, a Broadway film actress. The story is about her second husband getting arrested for check fraud, and only through his being arrested and being interrogated did they find out that he had been secretly married to Minna Gombel this whole time. And these every day, the Yiddish their Tog would have on the back a story of one of these vaudeville actors, and this would be something that was in all newspapers in New York. So this is from the same period, the same picture, just in the Seattle Star. And I guess Yiddish got the scoop on the Seattle Star. This is a couple weeks later, so who knows who broke the story. But this gives you a sense of what kind of culturally hybrid space the newspaper was, giving both very clear Yiddish news or Jewish news, but also exposing its readers to a variety of different things, whatever the editors thought they would want to buy. One of the main attractions, of course, of the newspapers were these novels, the serialized fiction. Novels and short stories, both high literature by famous and reputable authors, but also trashy potboilers, often anonymously authored. And they follow the same model as the pamphlets, so sometimes loose translations, sometimes adaptations, sometimes something else entirely. And by the interwar period, there are hundreds of Yiddish newspapers being published around the globe. So just think about how much fiction is being produced. Each one of these newspapers would have had this kind of fiction in it daily. So what I'm going to do now is show you just a bunch of different examples to give you a sense of what the variety of these different things might be. And most of them culled from a seminar I did with my graduate students last semester. So we'll start with this one, Der Missionaire, oder Verliebt in eine Tochter, a Roman von New Yorker Leben, The Missionary, or In Love with a Daughter, a novel of New York life by one Max L., so anonymously authored. This is a novel being investigated by my graduate student, Pammy Brenner. It's a story about Jewish-born converts to Christianity, their nefarious plots, and how they're overthrown by their pious daughter, who in turn, of course, also falls in love. What's interesting here is this is all published in Yiddish Tageblatt, which was an Orthodox Yiddish daily. So even an Orthodox Jewish newspaper, Yiddish newspaper, needed to print racy things in order to attract their readers. Now, jumping back to Eastern Europe, to Warsaw, this is Die blutige Frau, a merkwürdige Geschichte von Warschauer Geheimnisses, The Bloody Woman, a remarkable story of clandestine Warsaw. This is based on the model of the Eugene Soon model of The Mysteries of Paris. Perhaps you've heard of it, big 19th century novel, mostly all about underground or undercover cities, the sort of the black underside of the city. You have mysteries of New York, mysteries of London, and this is Mysteries of Warsaw, a Jewish version of it. And this is also supposedly adapted from a French novel. I could never find the original for it, though. And the plot here is a wealthy Jewish woman murders her husband and then marries her accomplice, a respected Jewish doctor. And then the story goes how her long-lost brother, her daughter, the honest workers framed for the crime, a Warsaw thief, and many other characters in this very sprawling novel succeed in finally bringing the bloody woman to justice. Okay, then the next one we have here, going back to America, Gold and Blut, a Roman von jüdischen Leben in Amerika, Gold and Blood, a novel of Jewish life in America. And this is by actually a very popular novelist. Leon Gottlieb was the sort of standard novelist for the New York's forverse of their potboiler novels, which he did over sort of 20 years. He wrote 25 novels during that period. And this was serialized in 148 installments in the newspaper in 1911. And this story begins with the poor man Naiman. He's gone to a hospital to donate blood to try to make some money from donating blood, only he finds himself lying right next to the person who he's giving blood, and that's Flora. And of course, he turns his head, their eyes lock, and they fall in love. Next, we have later in the New York and Forverts, we have this novel being investigated by my student August Gilchrist, Die Kidnappers von Kafkaz, The Kidnappers from the Caucasus. It's an episodic, picaresque novel about gangs and heroic villains of the Caucasus, their adventures and misadventures. And I want to show this because it goes to show that not all the novels had anything to do with Jewishness. This is just kind of an adventure novel, has no Jews in it, and it's just thought that they thought that this might be of interest to their readers who had some familiarity with Eastern Europe or with Russia, but now just wanted to read something that would be entertaining in their as they were sitting on the subway or something like that. Now, the serialized newspaper novel didn't mean the end of pamphleted novels, which made a comeback in the 1930s in Eastern Europe. Including this one by Urke Nachalnik. Urke Nachalnik was a celebrity thief in Warsaw, and he wrote this novel, Menschen ohne Morgen, Men with No Tomorrow, being translated and researched by my student Jonah Lubin. And I will not tell you anything about this semi-autobiographical novel because I don't want to give away anything. This is a real thriller, so you'll have to look for it on the shelves when it comes out. And there are, of course, thousands and thousands of more of these novels and short stories, and they come in all shapes and sizes and genres. There is a tendency, as you've probably already seen, for a lot of them to be contemporary novels of the cities in which they were printed, like New York, Warsaw, Buenos Aires, London, Moscow, and beyond. But there are plenty of other adventure novels set in exotic locations or in the distant past or even set in the future. Here's a 1908 adaptation of Famillion's novel about 10 million years in the future. It's about Halley's Comet coming to destroy the Earth. So also kind of a depressing novel. But as you can see, there are just so much material. It would be impossible, even if I were to run hundreds of seminars and have thousands of graduate students, to really even be able to encompass all this material. So one of the things we need to do in order to think about how this trash works would be to put it into using new technology to take it on. So to this end, I've started this website, shun.org, which so far we've only cataloged just the fiction from one newspaper, from the Forverts, from the New York Forverts, just 40 years of that newspaper. And over that 40-year period, they published 13,360 short stories and novels, which amounts to about a chapter or two of a novel every day, and a short story. It's a lot of fiction to be consuming on a regular basis. Here's some more statistics for you, just to see just how much material there is. And then there are, of course, those dozens of other newspapers and magazines that still need to be cataloged, along with all those books and pamphlets that were also published. And the idea is to have this digital repository that you can then use digital tools on. So things like machine reading, data visualization, natural language processing, and AI, and whatever else. So this project is just beginning, so we can talk more about it in the Q&A, but here's just a strange image of me actually walking through my data in 3D, which allows you to see it in different ways than just staring at an Excel sheet. It's actually pretty interesting. Okay, so that gives you just how big and how varied the different things might be. What I want to do now is just zoom in on one example to give you a taste of what it might sound like. And I'll read from a novel by Sarah B. Smith, the so-called Queen of the Schundroman, which appeared in that same edition of the newspaper that we saw earlier. So here it is. And the novel is Suchendik Glück, meaning looking for happiness. And it's about a young immigrant to New York named Mona, making her way through love affairs, sexual harassment, unwanted pregnancy, abortion. She eventually makes a career for herself as a lyricist for vaudeville and Broadway. Towards the end of the novel, she makes her way to Washington, D.C., carrying a pistol to threaten her lover, who's just been elected to Congress, to make sure that he marries her. I won't tell you what happens in Washington, D.C., but it's just everyday melodrama, really. And what I'm going to read is a particularly steamy scene between Mona and the man who will become her first husband. And I want to do that first to make you squirm in your seats a little bit, but also to give you a sense of why this might be pleasurable, why you'd want to read it. Just to set the scene for you, the two lovers have been separated for a couple of days, and now they're suddenly back together. Albert is hesitant since he has a heart ailment, and really shouldn't give in to their love or his lust for her. And Mona, our main character, is determined to win the game of love. So I'll just read it. Okay. He was frightened. What did he want to tell her? Bad news? Had his feelings for her changed? Had 3 days apart already erased the memory of that kiss? No. She wouldn't let him sway her with any sad tales. She wouldn't let Peril, that's her sister, laugh at her. She wanted to test her powers. She knew her charm, that she could burn him with her kisses. And so, as soon as he greeted her, without a word in response, she threw herself against him in the narrow entryway, taking his face into her hands and pressing her lips against his in the half-dark. It was a long and silent kiss. There are all kinds of kisses in this world. Some spill a universe of secrets. Others seal within them all that should otherwise have been said. And theirs was a silent kiss, and everything remained secret. Mona did not know that over the last 3 days, Albert had fought terribly within himself, trying to come to terms with his weak body. Finally, he had decided to refuse Mona's love, certain that living with a woman would do great harm to his sick heart and shorten his life. He had come to her now to tell the truth and part with her forever. But theirs was a silent kiss, so Albert did not understand that Mona only wanted to take revenge on her doubting sister, to make good on her bragging that she could make him marry her if she wanted to. Theirs was a silent kiss, so he did not know why she buried herself in his embrace, why her burning lips consumed his. All he knew was that her kisses warmed him, thrilled his heart, lit blue flames in him. He forgot all his resolutions. The girl he wanted so badly was in his grasp, kissing him with ardent devotion. When she finally let go of his lips, he whispered in her ear, "Come with me, Mona. Come with me now. I have an apartment. Come with me. Don't leave me alone. Don't ever leave me alone." Mona wanted to laugh, but some instinct warned her not to tease him. She had to be patient and tender. She put her cold hand to his cheek and said, "My darling Albert, don't be a fool. My darling boy, I thought you were cleverer than that. Clever boys don't kidnap their princesses in the middle of the night." "I want to have you. I want you to be mine. Mine forever, do you hear me?" "Yes, of course your girl hears you. Your girl's ears are so sensitive. But her wings are clipped. She cannot fly. She lives in a world with a mama, strict brothers whom she fears, and much else besides." He pressed her head against his shoulder and asked with a sigh, "What next then, my love, my kitten?" "A rabbi, a chuppah, and guests." "Ah, now I understand. What a fool I am. Sure, a chuppah. Let's find a chuppah." Now she let slip a laugh, giving him a peck on the cheek. She had learned the terrible game of love so quickly. So the dialogue here, the drama, is taken right out of the popular English fiction of the day. In particular, Mona's struggle for power and agency in conflict with the man's brute force and desire. I could go on about this, but my interest is in this line about the rabbi in the chuppah. Chuppah is a traditional Jewish wedding canopy. What's it doing here? There's no particular interest in the ritual itself or the guests that might come. There's no concern about what this collective event, this religious event might mean. It's a mark of Jewishness that seems to be easily conjured and then dismissed. Sure, a chuppah, soll sein a chuppah. The gesture toward Jewish ritual is meant more to break the rhythm and heat of the prose than to suggest anything about Jewish collectivity. It's just a way to stop Albert's lascivious desire for Mona's body, while neither she nor Albert nor the readers care much for rabbis or traditions. Rather, what the readers probably care about is the mess of American love and American sex. This is what I mean about what trash can do. The novel is in Yiddish. It's for Yiddish readers, but it does not dwell on its Yiddishness. It takes readers elsewhere. It brings them into a much larger community than they otherwise would have expected from a Yiddish newspaper. What they're reading in this novel makes them part of the American and even transnational empire of the romance novel. The Schundroman, Yiddish trash, is a text that can, with wild abandon and seemingly low stakes, it's on the last page after all, leave behind all that serious stuff. Leave behind much of what we might think Yiddish should be, for a cultural space that is muddled, transgressive, uncontrolled, and yes, trashy. Now the question is, why might this be important? Why read these kinds of novels? If it's just trash, if it's ephemeral, if you can just discard it afterwards, why read it at all? Why would I translate this for you, that you might be able to read it? Why should I give you this other piece of Yiddish when you already know so much Yiddish already? Well, for one, I would say we're allowed pleasure. And pleasure is not some trivial thing. I'm translating this novel, and hopefully it'll be taken up by a big, fancy press, because it's entertaining, because it presents a fantasy of feminist autonomy, because it's Yiddish without national tragedy. This kind of fantasizing can be radical, to follow the thinking of Lauren Berlant, even as it still reinforces patriarchal authority or heteronormative structures. It's important to imagine the world otherwise, especially in times when such fantasizing is so difficult. But who wouldn't want to be a famous lyricist on vaudeville these days? Second, I think trash is important because it allows us to think in translational ways, what I've called elsewhere reading in Teich, reading in the spaces between cultures. I don't mean this in some kind of multicultural sense or in a way to encourage some kind of cultural literacy, because if you were to read a Sarah Smith novel, you wouldn't learn much about Yiddish. It's not a novel that represents Yiddish culture in some holistic way. Rather, what it presents to the reader is actually a mess of things, a text made up of multiple and not necessarily compatible cultural discourses. Reading a Yiddish romance novel leads you to ask all these kinds of questions like, how does the romance novel circulate outside of Western Europe? How does the narrative device of the triangular love triangle, right? How does that get translated into other languages? What are the imperial or colonial lines of influence or coercion that make that kind of translation possible? Does this result in a kind of homogenizing of culture, right? All romance novels are the same, or does the process of uncomfortable adaptation lead to a fracturing of the thing itself? Can a romance novel open up the romance to new hybridities, and is that a good thing? This is what I mean by the title of my talk, Popular Literature in Diaspora. Reading popular literature and examining the way it encourages theft and borrowing, appropriation and reconfiguration, the maximizing of entertainment and pleasure over ideological commitment, all this can encourage diasporic thinking, a thinking between cultures, thinking through the consequences of cultural contradiction and cultural convergence. And finally, as a result of this, what I call a diasporic mode, Yiddish trash forces us to think differently about modern Jewish culture more broadly. We can avoid the constraints of post-disaster sentimentalism and move towards cross-cultural and comparative modes. By this I mean that while I admire and even participate in the impulse toward ethnography, canonization, and conservation, researching and preserving that which makes Yiddish unique, I also want to advocate for other kinds of radical, dynamic, and even chaotic modes of Yiddish learning and creativity. I want to call attention to irreverent practices of Yiddish culture, examining those things that run up against somber modes of memory and mourning that come into conflict with canonized forms of tragedy and comedy, and then see what happens if we just let Yiddish ram right through it all. What I hope for my project is that this kind of reading will carry Yiddish into the future, almost or partly unburdened from normative and prescriptive expectations, getting us away from all the Yiddish we think we know, and then leading us not towards the redemption of Yiddish, not to its rebirth, but to its continued and wild trashiness. Thank you.
Testing. Thank you so much for that hilarious and very enlightening talk. And thanks to the Academy and yourself for inviting me to share it with you and discuss the trash. And now that we know that this is the very first Yiddish talk in this room, although not the first time even in the last month that Yiddish has been spoken on this stage.
Yeah.
I think we need sort of, I'm not going to actually fully say a Shehechianu, but we should have the intention of this moment of Jewish prayer where you acknowledge the first time that something happens. But also, yeah, I think what you're talking about is this continuity, both of high culture and low culture. And I think also the question about the continuity of Yiddish is something that you just gestured to with the question of bringing Yiddish into the future. But I'm wondering, where is the role of the actual Yiddish language within that, to a certain extent? And it's interesting because your book, which I should have just ordered, but I had it printed out very expensively in color, starts with a page in Yiddish, and talked quite a lot about this translation back and forth of questionable source material, and maybe didn't even really exist, but inventing like sonnets from the Portuguese. So I was interested in your actual manifesto. He wrote a manifesto. It's the title of the book, and it starts with a manifesto in Yiddish with 10 points. And then on the other side, you have the same 10 points in English. And so it asks already a question about translation, because they're kind of different. They're a little bit different.
They're a little bit different, yeah.
So number 6, you say, Teich zeichen nicht ob kein Schetich von jiddische Totalkeit. Schetich is territory. Teich does not mark a space of Jewish totality. It doesn't mark a space. And so you're already working in this Hebrew stuff that Shund throws out.
Yeah. So what's the question?
The question is, which version was translated?
So you want me to get the history of the manifesto. So what happened was that I was a young assistant professor, and I was invited to this. I was invited to a seminar about this idea of critical Jewish studies. So along the same lines as we have critical race theory, people are trying to think about in this seminar, what would it like to think more in theory around Jewish studies. Jewish studies historically has been a field dominated by philology and by history, not by necessarily theories of Jewishness or theories of Jewish studies itself. It's a field that doesn't always theorize itself very well. And I said, well, I don't think Yiddish studies has theorized itself very well. We don't really know what Yiddish is or how it functions. We have these big texts by these big, founders of the field. And I thought, someone's inviting me to this thing, and I'm just going to go with it. What would happen? What would it look like to write a manifesto about this field? And I wrote the manifesto in English, and I presented it to all these people who were much more interested in other fields of Jewish studies and not necessarily in Yiddish. And so I felt like I was sort of giving this manifesto to people that didn't need to hear it. And I was trying to think, well, what would it mean to give this to the field of Yiddish studies? And how could I do this in the book? And I was like, oh, I'm going to have my 10 points. I'm going to put them on a wall. But the idea sort of came to me like, how can I do that without actually doing it in Yiddish? How can you have a field that's about a language, but all of the scholarship around it takes place only in translation? And that was actually thematized in the book. I said to myself, well, Yiddish is a language that lends itself to translation in some way. Yiddish is itself not very Jewish, if you think about it, right? It's a Germanic language, that its own Jewishness is somewhat unstable in some way. So I wanted to produce a text that would be both faithful to that sense of like, oh, this needs to be in the language, but also that invites translation. And translation for me is not an idea of reproduction. Translation is never reproduction. Translation is always a distortion of one kind or another. And you can have control over that distortion, or you can play with it, or you can ignore it. And I wanted to be to do all of those things at once. So when I think I've sort of modeled my practice on the same things that these writers of Shun did. This sense of like, well, who am I giving this to, and what do they need, and what kind of opportunities does that give me? I could translate word for word Flaubert for the audience. I could translate word for word Tolstoy, and maybe that's what they need. And many of the early translators were like, we need to give the people Tolstoy so that they'll become proper citizens of the world or something. But then other anonymous translators who wanted to make money came and said, well, actually, I need to spice this up for them. I need to change it. This is where the audience is, and this is the kind of stuff I need to give them. And so that's a lot of the ways I think about Yiddish studies. Yiddish studies is a field that sometimes takes place in Yiddish, sometimes doesn't take place in Yiddish. And I wanted to give people many different avenues of entry into that space. So trying to mirror my scholarship to the Yiddish newspaper as a place that's both wanting to invite people into Yiddish, but also providing avenues into it for anyone that wants to get lots of different things out of it.
And your process of translation that you just showed us is also, you told me at the dinner that there was a little bit of license that was taken there. And I think that's really interesting that there's still this dialogue happening between English, between Yiddish, also German. Here in Germany, when you show the titles of the books, people might recognize some of the words.
Yeah. The question is, how does that legibility work? Or how can you play with that legibility? Or also, I'm translating a romance novel for the contemporary world, in which romance novel means something different nowadays than it did in the early 20th century. How much of this novel do I need to make? I know romantasy is really in right now with flying dragons and all different kinds of things. I'm not going to insert fairies into this Yiddish novel, but what are the vocabularies of the contemporary romance novel that need to be inside this novel that I'm translating, and how much of that is also part of the process of translation?
And this is actually also a dialogue with the reader and their expectations. And does the reader expect a chuppah when they're talking about marriage? And are you providing that? I think what was interesting when I saw your translation just now for the first time, because you sent me the original earlier, was that the most literary moment for me in the book was not quite, or in the passage was not quite present in your translation in the way that I had read it. And I thought that was really interesting. The speaking kisses and the non-speaking kisses. How do you interpret that?
I love this idea that you, on the one hand, romance novels and popular literature needs a ton of just like plot download, right? So you like in popular literature and trash, like you need a lot of shortcuts to bring your viewer or reader along in something. Like, you just don't have time to spend on figuring out what exactly is going on, or to have a subtle nod from one character to another. Like, you need to tell them this character is in love with the other one, and this is exactly what's happening. Obscure. And so there's a lot of these novels are just like heavily loaded down by just like, this is what happened next, and then this happened, and this is what they were feeling. They were feeling exactly this, right? Rather than have them have some kind of vague monologue. And that can be hard to read sometimes. It can sort of bog you down, but it also is an invitation to let the reader in and get them to the dialogue, which is the thing they really want to read, right? You really want to read that sort of sexy conversation at the end. You want to just get through all the motivations beforehand. So I wanted to sort of acknowledge that kind of structure to the text, this need to give information, but then also give pleasure at the same time.
And it's hilarious.
Yeah.
But also kind of...
I think it was meant, I know everyone was laughing, I think it was also meant to be hilarious, even as it was also meant to be, titillating in some way, right? It's exciting, but also they're like, this is really, like, they must have thought as a readers, like, this is really hammed up. Like, she's being a coquettish flirt. She's meant to sound like a flirt. She's meant to be funny. And Albert is also way too serious in the rest of the novel. So there is at least this moment of comedy in it. Yeah.
I think one of the things that you bring up quite a lot in the book, which made me almost psychoanalyze myself, is this politics of representation with Yiddish specifically, but I think with languages in general. And those of us who speak smaller languages, I think we always feel like when you mention a language that you're sort of representing it for the first time. So if I tell someone I speak Yiddish, they're surprised by that. And then whatever I say next becomes their first impression of Yiddish. And so to a certain extent, this event has become the first impression of Yiddish for some of these people in the audience. Do you feel a kind of responsibility when you created this titillating scene as everyone's first impression of Yiddish literature?
Yeah, no, people, Yiddishists refer to this as the question. Right, so you go up to someone, they ask you what you do, and you say you study Yiddish, and then you immediately are going to get the question, why? Right? Because if you were studying French literature or German literature, you often don't get that question. It's like, oh, that's the thing that you study. Why Yiddish? Suddenly you are interpolated into this mission, this responsibility that otherwise you might not have thought of. And it's also not something that's just of one particular generation. My teachers and their teachers had to face this same question as well. And it immediately makes one have to be autobiographical. Not just why Yiddish in general, but suddenly why would you do Yiddish? And what they're fishing for is like, do you have an ancestor who speaks Yiddish? Do you have some kind of personal connection? Do you have some kind of psychological need for Yiddish? And I, in the past, have done whatever the hoops I needed to do in order to satisfy that expectation of Yiddish. Give my autobiography to give this person the Yiddish that they want. They want to know that I have a Yiddish-speaking grandparent, that I have this sentimental or comedic relationship with Yiddish or another. Whether or not that story was accurate, I knew that was what they needed from me, and that was the Yiddish that they already knew and felt like they needed confirmed to them. But I did have this other experience very early in my Yiddish studies. I was taking a flight. It was a long flight across the Atlantic, and I was doing my Yiddish homework. I had a Yiddish dictionary open, and I was doing all this work. I was very diligent, and this Hasidic man walked up to me. He said, he asked me that question, why are you studying Yiddish? I tried to explain to him, Literatur, I'm studying literature. And he said, Geschäft? Meaning business. I said, no, literature, Geschäft. He just didn't understand what this term literature was. And for him, the only reason why anyone would want to study Yiddish would be to have some kind of business relationship with the Hasidic community. That was how he understood modernity, as always a financial relationship. And it was surprising. It's like, well, like, he doesn't care about my autobiography. He doesn't read my biology in Yiddish. He reads his distorted sense of what the modern world is. And that for me was exciting. Like, oh, what would happen if someone wanted to read this Sarah Smith novel just because it was an entertaining read, not because she had survived this or that thing, or because she represented this or that thing. And in my wildest ambitions, I think of the novel as rivaling, Elena Ferrante's novels, right? What if there was, if you look at the cover of the Elena Ferrante novels, the original ones that came out, say My Brilliant Friend, the word Italian doesn't appear anywhere on the cover. Right? They wanted to sell it as has a novel with some romance elements in it, some intellectual things, but it's meant to be a popular novel. And that's what they were selling, not Naples, right? They weren't selling some small universe of Italy. And there's a story of one of the most famous Yiddish writers of the 20th century, Sholem Asch. Actually, perhaps maybe someone has heard he thought he was going to win the Nobel Prize in the 1930s. He's a big Yiddish writer, wrote lots of novels. His novels were translated heavily into French, German, and English and other languages. And he got berated by his Yiddish readers because they saw these novels, and on the title page and on the cover, there was no mention of the word Yiddish. Not one mention of the word Yiddish. And he responded, and bombastically and self-involved that he was, he said, people know my name. They know I'm Sholem Asch and I represent Yiddish literature. There's no need to put the Yiddish word on the title page. sort of defending himself as the representative or the ambassador for Yiddish, which he definitely thought himself as. But I was wondering, well, actually, maybe that's a good thing that Yiddish isn't on the cover page, right? What would it look like if a Yiddish novel was a bestseller? What would that mean for Yiddish? What would people think of Yiddish afterwards if they knew first Sarah Smith instead of Sholem Aleichem? And I mean, that's not going to happen probably, right? Sholem Aleichem has such a hold on our global imaginary of what Yiddish is or could be. But it's an interesting thought experiment for me that I would love to happen. I mean, some of it has to do with the name Sarah Smith, her name being generic in this incredible way that would enable that kind of escape of Yiddish from some of its own overdeterminations. But that's the fantasy, at least.
But in that particular case, I think it's interesting. I mean, the book is called Mona. The author's name is Sarah Smith. It was her married name. Her husband was from Belarus, right, and was named Schmidt, which is also not a very Jewish name,
right,
but changed it. I think it was Mayer Schmidt and
became Max Smith.
Max Smith. Yeah. And I think there's something there in this sort of mythology of we changed our name at Ellis Island that could be unpacked. It doesn't have to be. It doesn't. Oh, we don't have to be serious. We could just enjoy the romance novel. But there's a reason why she's named Sarah Smith, and that reason is anti-Semitism. Maybe.
Well, maybe. No. So one of the things, just to correct, people did not change their names at Ellis Island.
It's a mythology.
Yeah. That's an amazing thing, that sort of mythology of like needing to, like some kind of anti-Semitic border control person can't read your papers and so gives you a different name, that served a particular purpose in the mythology of Jewish American culture, right? Of sort of coming out of the old world and becoming some new and established presence in American culture. And yes, I understand. I think it's important that we know at some point that this is a Yiddish novel, or we know that Sarah Smith has this particular history. And it's not as if there are no Jews in Sarah Smith's novels. They are. The novel begins with a pogrom. So there's plenty of tragedy that comes in and plenty of that history, but that one of the interesting things, what would it look like to evoke that tragedy but not make it determine the entirety of the space that Yiddish might live in?
Yeah.
Right? So I don't think that it's impossible or even worth it to get rid of any notion of conservation or dealing with trauma or with all the other things that come with Yiddish. We don't want to throw any of that away, but that what if we gave a little bit more voice or bump to the other parts of Yiddish?
So what kind of Yiddish trash do you see today, and what kind of trash do you want to see more of in the future?
So that's a hard thing to think about what the contemporary trash is, because the model of Larry David is so strong and has its own life, right? So Yiddish as being something inherently funny, or Yiddish being associated with particular Jewish American experience, Yiddish being associated with a grandmother, for instance, or I don't know, chicken soup or something. That world or a notion of Yiddish has such a long history. It's a history that's 150 years old, that notion of Yiddish, that you can't dislodge it. So that so much of what you might see of Yiddish today is so tied to those things. And so many institutions are built on that notion of Yiddish without even maybe knowing a word of Yiddish. I think the scene that I quoted from Curb Your Own Enthusiasm with Larry David, they don't actually say any Yiddish words. They just sort of make various guttural sounds to one another. And it, for a Yiddishist, it's offensive. It's like, well, no, this is a real language. There's things you actually need to learn. But for so many people, Jews and non-Jews, that is a very legible thing. That is Yiddish in some sense. For the same way that there are, multiple forms of English, multiple forms of all different kinds of cultures and languages that exist and move in different realms, so too Yiddish has all those things, which you can't just erase them because you found other ones. But sort of, how can we adjust the competition between those Yiddishes, or what other forms of Yiddish trash might rival the dominant form of Yiddish trash is interesting to me.
And the journal that you founded, in Geweb, which is celebrating its 10th year this year. Mm-hmm. I saw last year they were announcing a science fiction contest.
Yes.
For new Yiddish science fiction.
Yeah, so the journal that we founded, ingeweb.org, it's a journal of Yiddish studies. At first, we were given this idea by a scholar in the field, and we were supposed to just make an academic journal. Right? There's no academic journal for Yiddish studies. We need one. You are young people. You go make one and make it digital. And we were like, okay. But we were also children of the blogger generation of live journals. And we were like, well, why can't this journal also be a popular organ? We had this idea, at least I did, that Yiddish, that we were going to make an N+1 or a Jacobin or all these small little like left-wing journals that were coming up in the early 2000s, that we were going to make one that was Yiddish, and it was going to have this element that was going to be popular or popularist. So we had academic articles, we had posts about pedagogy and Yiddish pedagogy, but then we also had a big translation section and a blog, right? So that we could try to feed into some kind of reshape what we imagine to be the popular narrative of Yiddish. Ingeveb hasn't become an enormous website that everyone opens all the time, but our traffic is pretty steady. That was the sort of the idea of like, well, what else is Yiddish? Where else can we sort of promote or think about Yiddish outside of the traditional ways it's been thought of?
And I guess maybe part of that, this question of the Yiddish Literary Journal, not literary, the Yiddish Academic Journal with also some literary elements, is this sort of question of how to shape the narrative of what Yiddish is, who has control over that narrative. There's this competition. I think you're dealing with that quite a lot in your book and also with your new project by translating Schund. Yeah. And do you feel like there is a sense of like Shanda for the Goyim, like there's this kind of like, sorry, I got to translate that.
That to present these kinds of Yiddish would be embarrassing for the Jewish people or something.
Yeah, there is this sort of, this collective embarrassment, and you use the word anxiety in your book as well. There is an anxiety that Shalom Aleichem has about what Yiddish is, and he's embarrassed of Shomer's existence and by the hundreds and thing of these parents.
Yeah, so it's a problem from the 19th century that persists today. Yeah, so Shalom Aleichem hated Shomer not only because he was outselling him, but because Shalom Aleichem wanted to normalize Yiddish literature, wanted to establish Yiddish as a European literature just like any other. And being accused of theft or being accused of stealing something from another literature, Shalom Aleichem didn't want that. It wanted it to be naturally and organic, stemming out of the Jewish people, right? So Shalom Aleichem is a nationalist in that sense, wanting to produce a Yiddish novel, not a novel that's a reproduction of some European one. He didn't want to think of himself as second-rate. He wanted to see what the particular thing is that Yiddish could contribute to the world and create institutions around that particularity. Shalom Aleicham's success or failure in that is debatable, but it is, sort of subscribing to a particular European novel about what a culture is, what a national culture is, and what the responsibility of its writers might be to that. And Shomer represented, a kind of messiness that doesn't fit into the way we like to categorize national cultures, right? This culture goes over here, this culture goes over there, you put boundaries around it. Sometimes those boundaries are enforced by state power. And Yiddish didn't seem to follow that in a great way. And Shalom Aleichem wanted to sort of create institutions that would somehow approximate that sort of family of nations model. And I think Yiddish as a language and a culture associated with a kind of diasporic population has trouble fitting into that model. I think all literatures and all cultures have trouble fitting into that model. No one can be contained by boundaries. But I think Yiddish as a language sometimes wears that flexibility or porousness on its sleeve. And that continues to today. Try to think about, how to shed this notion of responsibility to Yiddish. I can't, right? I know that as soon as I step up and start talking about Yiddish, that I am representing that field. I am representing that language. Someone is going to project a certain kind of Jewishness onto me. And I can't deny that is also part of my own motivation. I also cringe when people laugh at Larry David. It's hard for me to listen to like some kind of joke about Yiddish sound, right? But at the same time, I grew up in that world. It's a language that I know intimately, and that also I can't deny others. So there's a kind of push and pull, yes. I mean, that's how anxiety works. Anxiety is not a thing that gets resolved, and anxiety is a thing that one sort of dances with.
So. Yeah, I think I definitely have felt that as the person who had to moderate this question of the what is Yiddish, and I think you have this you have done a great job of both representing Yiddish in its fullness, but also allowing us to laugh, and I think that is not an easy task. So I think it's time now for us to open to questions from the audience. So if raise your hand, and we have one right up here in front, second row.
written this down. And I asked the question in the context of revival of Yiddish as a living language. Language in general is always evolving, incorporating new words and concepts. How does Yiddish absorb these changes and the changes in culture and society? And with Yiddish studies today, is that the study of a preservation of a language from the past or a living language of the present?
Yes, excellent question. I don't usually like the term Renaissance of Yiddish. So I did this study, I called it my zombie listicle of Yiddish. If you go back, say, 100, 150 years of the New York Times, you'll find periodically every 10 years an article announcing the rebirth of Yiddish, or the death of Yiddish and the rebirth of Yiddish. So Yiddish as a language has been rumored and predicted to be dying for at least 200 years now. So, the modernization in 19th century, people just assumed, oh, Jews are going to move to the cities and they'll stop speaking Yiddish. So I don't think of Yiddish in those terms. Yiddish is not an endangered language in the same way that Ross Perlin, who spoke here a couple of months ago, my fellow, speaks of those kind of micro languages. It's a language that's been continually spoken, and now a language of a very, a million, if not more. There's changing estimates of population of Hasidic speakers of Yiddish. It's a language that is evolving in that sense. There's many linguists of Hasidic Yiddish who go into those communities, and Yiddish is changing to this day. So it has lots of English, Israeli Hebrew in it, Dutch, depending on where the speakers of Yiddish are living. So it is, in that sense, very much a living language. But there are lots of that's the contemporary speakers of Yiddish. But there's also what we might call heritage or secondary speakers of Yiddish, invented Yiddishes, inherited Yiddishes, partial or fractured Yiddishes, and those are also part of the language. And so I would say they're not always mutually discernible, or they don't necessarily understand one another. And so Yiddish studies as a field runs the gamut of all those different things, both those interested in kind of preservation or archival work, and those who are on the ground linguists and anthropologists trying to study what's going on today. So it is, I think, one of those fields that is expansive both in time and space, but also because of where Yiddish is located, whether imbricated in the sort of different communities of Eastern Europe, historic communities of Eastern Europe, or globally into all these other languages. It's a field that is a non-field in that sense, that it always demands comparison, always demands cross-cultural conversation. How can you talk about Yiddish without being able to know Ukrainian, Russian, Polish, and be able to understand the complexity of those relationships in those communities? So it kind of demands that kind of cross-cultural dialogue, regardless of where you are in the Yiddish studies.
Hi, thank you for that. I'm quite curious that you didn't mention Yiddish anarchist poetry and literature that was running concurrent to the trash that you talk about. And it was, I just came across this beautiful book, Anna Elena Torres's book, and I was so shocked because I had a Yiddish grandmother, so I had that experience. And I realized that she was hidden away. There was so much shame around her as a survivor, and her language wasn't celebrated. And also in this book, she talks about how 5 of the 6 million Jews that were killed in the Holocaust, they were Yiddish speakers. So that genocide decimated that culture. And it's also, there was one beautiful thing, Abba Gordon, the poet, talks about a Yiddish ethic, which, and so I just guess what I'm confused about is you kind of stripping the political possibilities of it, which are full of joy and full of humor too, and the modernist use of Yiddish.
Yeah, so I would say, just to sort of, to explain a little bit, all those newspapers I mentioned are aligned with all different kinds of political and cultural lines. So anarchists, communists, socialists of all different stripes, folkists, nationalists of all different kinds. So, I focused on the trash, and trash, in order to sell itself, often tries at least to strip much of its political leanings as to appeal to the largest, broadest population possible. But a lot of these newspapers were, publishing fiction that was ideologically determined, or part of that community, or celebrating that community, or out of that community, and modernists of various stripes and conflicting with one another. So yes, a long tradition of Yiddish art anarchists and communists in the U.S. and Eastern Europe, and everywhere. So I didn't mean, I'm sorry if you got that impression, but that, I'm not saying that Schund or trash is apolitical, but that one of the things it aspires to is a kind of broad politics that can actually be self-defeating in that sense. So the Vorwärts, for instance, where several of the novels that I mentioned took place, was supposedly a socialist newspaper. But some of the authors of the novels that they were publishing, it didn't necessarily have socialist messaging. So that sometimes you would publish something in some sort of trash in your newspaper in order to draw readers in and then give them some anarchism or socialism on the side. So there was a kind of a complicated, and that's what I meant by sort of self-contradictory institutions. And the other thing about Yiddish is that, while there are all of these groups, one of the things we have to understand is that these groups were fighting over readers, but also, like many things, many of these readers were just what we call in Yiddish, Jiden von der ganz Jahr, Jews of the whole year is the translation, but also just sort of people getting by that may have associated with a party here and there, but didn't necessarily feel that they were represented by one community. This is one of the results of Yiddish not having a government or having a governmental structure, is that there are institutions that will try to bring you into their communities, but there was no sort of requirement that one speak Yiddish and then identify with a particular party or line of politics. So it makes it very fluid in that sense, that some of the things that might unite an entire Yiddish-speaking community or divide them are not always the most predictable.
I have a slight announcement, which is there is actually an exhibition coming up about Yiddish anarchism, specifically Millie Witkop. Is it the 23rd is the opening? 23rd of November, and there's some flyers outside.
Yeah.
At Galerie Zeitzone. If you're interested in Yiddish anarchism, you should check it out. Also, there's a Yiddish cabaret with contemporary Yiddish poetry and music next Thursday. There's also a few flyers for that outside. Sorry, I got to use my stage. And Jordan, I think we have a question.
Yes.
Hi, thanks so much for your talk and your amazing work. In Geweb is very important. I hope I can articulate this correctly. So it seems like you set up this dichotomy between the disaster narrative of the Churban and the Holocaust, this kind of tragic sentimentalism. I think you used the term post-disaster sentimentalism. Definitely agree that exists. And then this kind of redemption and comedy, Larry David, and I agree with what you're doing there in saying that that's not going far enough. I just wonder why you're putting Schund in the seat of what can redeem then Yiddish. Because for me, Schund kind of confirms some of the priors or the stereotypes that I saw inside of the community through my Yiddish Bove, where she's saying that's jargon, that's low, Weiberteich. It has this very low connotation that someone like Celia Drupkin say, for me, disables, right? Because it's complex poetry, modernist. Like the literary stuff can maybe disable that in a different way. So how does Schund do that for you?
Yeah, so I think stereotypes are really important and not things to be defeated or fight against. As soon as you start fighting against the stereotype, you've already confirmed it. Right? So you say, I am not that thing. You immediately establish yourself in relationship to whatever that image is. And I think one of the best ways to disable or diffuse or flatten stereotypes in some way is to actually lean into them. This is how the best comedy works, per se, right? If you become the tramp in the Charlie Chaplin model, then something happens to the tramp that otherwise you wouldn't. Otherwise, the tramp is a negative image, right? But Charlie Chaplin becomes the tramp in this really embodied way and really like concrete way, such that it takes on a new life and has a new kind of energy to it. And so I would like the same for Yiddish. So Yiddishists of many generations have been pushing back against this notion of Yiddish being a bastard German, like a dirty vernacular, a language of the women and of the children, and saying, no, that's not what Yiddish is. No, it's a proper language. And and that was in this combative mode, right? That attempted to sort of put a mirror up and then and distinguish oneself from it. And my question is, and maybe I'm wrong and misguided, but what happens if you lean into the trashiness of Yiddish, at least in part, but not the trashiness that someone might expect? Like, what happens if the tramp gets up and starts speaking Yiddish, right? What would that mean if Charlie Chaplin, like there's of course also many of those rumors around Charlie Chaplin actually being Jewish, or his playing with that Jewishness, playing with stereotypes of Jewishness, I think was very powerful for his identity as a performer. So imagining what would happen if the same way you weren't protecting Yiddish from those things that threatened it, but actually learned to think about what would happen if you took on some of those identities. And I think people are doing this. I think something like a cabaret has a lot of that feel to it. Like, let's just be kind of loose with Yiddish in a way that, Yankov Gladstein, the great modernist poet, would never go to a Yiddish cabaret, right? Or someone like Kadya Molodovsky, who even in the face of tragedy would say, no, we need to create a sovereign space for Yiddish. She was very serious about it. No, I think a cabaret is a very different way of experiencing and taking on some of those stereotypes of Yiddish as queer, Yiddish as dirty, and moving it somewhere else.
I think we have time for one more question. Yeah, over here.
You used toward the end of your talk, you used the phrase diasporic Yiddish romance. And I was wondering if this is a category that you're going to kind of establish and look at, or is this something that you want to avoid because you sort of want to blow up what we think of is Yiddish? So would that sort of run counter to your project to look at this as a category?
So one of the experiences I've had is of translating this and trying to think about where it would fit in the contemporary, book publishing scene, is just how big and how varied romance has become, especially in the last 15, 20 years. People writing online, fan fiction, self-publishing. It's really truly an amazing diasporic genre. It has its deep problems, right? But you can read a romance novel of the historical period about dragons or about Amish people, right? There's Amish romance as an actual, like a very big genre nowadays. And trying to think about what does that mean, so that I don't want to think about Yiddish romance or the romance novel as somehow its own unique thing, or it's separated again in its own sovereign space. But what it means to think about Yiddish as not unique in that way. Right? This is not the only romance novel that was written in the so-called minor language. Right? A lot of those languages, if we think also in terms of post-colonial thoughts or thoughts about these languages of the margins or languages that were conquered by various imperial forces, what do their literatures look like, and what do they look like alongside Yiddish? So that's what I want to think about. Is right. Certainly Jews and Jewishness have a different figuration within empire than your colonial peripheries, and different relationships to empire. And I think that is going to be articulated in this idea of the romance. So when I say a diasporic romance, I'm not thinking of it only being owned by Yiddish in some way. Actually, what I want to think about is it as almost as a process of disowning. What would it mean to think about this text as Yiddish, but also not Yiddish at the same time, even if the entire text is written in Yiddish and just for Yiddish speakers? What would it mean to let the reins off of that for a little bit?
Okay, one more, and then we have a reception in the third room.
I just wonder, maybe that's the question I have is Yiddish not a language that you need to? I mean, it's a cultural place. It's like Swiss German. You need to grow up in the mountains to speak and understand what it's all about. Isn't Yiddish the same thing? If you haven't been part of it, how do you? I mean, you can't just learn the language and speak Yiddish all of a sudden.
So
you haven't grown up.
I have some news for you. Sarah Smith did not grow up with Yiddish.
Yeah, but
so she arrived in the United States after growing up in Hungary, and she had to start working in the in the factories. She didn't like it. She said, well, what can I do besides working in these sweatshops? And there were these Yiddish newspapers. She knew German, and she, probably had a little bit of Yiddish from the home, but it wasn't a main language of her life. And so she learned it and got a job in the Yiddish press. First, she was a reporter for she was a court reporter around divorces, and that was like a scandalous divorce column that she had for a while. And she was so good at it that she then started writing novels out of that. And so, she's not unique to Yiddish. Some of the major Yiddishists of the 19th and 20th century did not grow up with Yiddish. Some of the biggest Bundists, big Yiddish socialists, didn't know any Yiddish and had to have other people translate their articles for them. And the biggest, Yiddishist of all time, right, Weinreich himself, founder of YIVO, did not grow up with Yiddish. So it's sort of like this notion of like, well, what is this language? Who owns it? What does it mean to own it? Who's allowed to own it? Is really fascinating to me. And how did one come to that ownership? The fact that I might have this biological supposed connection to Yiddish doesn't mean that I then have exclusive ownership over it. In fact, one of the ways we might think about Yiddish as trashy is a way to give it over to other people, not in the formula of diplomatic exchange, but a kind of something that seeps out in a very different way.
And isn't it fair to say